Act 1 of Romeo and Juliet establishes a setting defined by hatred, an ancient grudge between two households. It also establishes an autocratic world where patriarchs give orders, and those orders are mostly followed. It's a world where a tradition of hatred combines with a tradition of social hierarchy to produce a culture within which our protagonists struggle to find an identity of their own. Like, how can anyone actually be an individual in such a tribal setting? Juliet is sexualized and expected to marry and become a young mother from the moment that she can walk. Her parents push her towards a marriage that she wouldn't even think about if left on her own. Similarly, Romeo is expected to be a man in a number of socially approved of ways. His sadness and his idealization of love are framed as character flaws that need to be remedied. His friends mock his poetic language and encourage him to participate in their dirty jokes. And both Romeo and Juliet are expected to hate anyone named Capulet or Montague. In these and many other ways, the norms and expectations within Verona serve as an oppressive authority that our protagonists need to resist. In Act 2, we see Romeo literally climb over the externally imposed barriers that attempt to keep him away from his internal desires. We see Juliet ignore the socially imposed rules of courtship and recommendations of her parents in order to pursue her personal desires. In Act 2, love is a form of protest, a resistance to the authority dictated by the setting, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And if this kind of discussion sounds fun to you, please consider subscribing and checking out more of my videos about Shakespeare. And with that out of the way, let's go through Act 2 of Romeo and Juliet play by play. Act 2 opens with Romeo choosing to slip away from his friends to pursue Juliet, leaving Mercutio and Benvolio to call for him, calling him back into the world of approved male friendship. It's clear, however, that they don't understand him. They still believe that he is in love with Rosaline, and Mercutio continues to make sexual puns, implying that Romeo's lovesickness is rooted in sexual frustration. The most striking of these puns has Mercutio dramatically say, "O Romeo, that she were, oh, that she were an open arse, thou a poprin pear." This is a reference to the medlar fruit, a fruit that is rotten before it ever becomes ripe. It looks like this, and I hope that's enough to explain the joke. But another interesting bit about that speech is that Mercutio makes fun of the type of poetry that we're about to hear in the balcony scene. When he attempts to conjure Romeo by evoking the quivering legs of Rosaline, yelling, "O Romeo, that she were," he foreshadows Juliet's famous lines in the next scene. "O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?" Shakespeare makes fun of Juliet's overly affected language before he has her deliver it. And yet, her poetry still hits. I just think that that's such a flex. He shows you how to make fun of his own poetry, and then he still writes a bar that becomes one of the most memorable lines ever written in the English language. But ignoring that, let's just take note that both Mercutio and Juliet attempt to conjure Romeo from the darkness by calling his name, but only Juliet succeeds. When Juliet speaks his name, he actually appears. And it's also worth saying that wherefore means why in early modern English. When she says, "Wherefore art thou Romeo?" she's asking, "For what reason are you Romeo?" It's a commonly misunderstood line. I figured I'd just get that out of the way before proceeding with the rest of the balcony scene. So Romeo begins Act 2, Scene 2 with a memorable little metaphor comparing Juliet to the sun. The moon is associated with the goddess Diana, who is the goddess of chastity and virginity. So when Romeo says that the moon's vestal livery is but sick and green, and none but fools do wear it, cast it off, and compares her to the sun, he is kind of saying that she should cast off the expectations of sexual purity associated with Diana and the moon, and that she should let herself be the sun rather than the moon, and be passionate rather than chaste. Those purity standards are a socially imposed form of authority that she should resist. When Juliet finally speaks, she speaks those famous lines. "O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name. Or, if thou wilt not, be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet." And with that, she's voicing a desire that Romeo simply cast off his name and cease to be a Montague. And that might be more revolutionary than it appears. Verona, as it has been constructed in this play, forces Montagues and Capulets to hate each other. The social condition of Verona categorizes individuals and then limits their behavior within that categorization. Romeo is a Montague, and must submit himself to the rules that govern the category of Montague. Juliet, in those lines, implies that her individual desire can overthrow that authority. She's using command statements: deny thy father, refuse thy name. She's not saying, oh, I wish you could deny your father. She's demanding it. She tells him to stop being the Montague and refuse the limitations of the category of Montague. We might view it as naive or immature, but her desire is literally revolutionary here. She's overthrowing the authority of Verona's social categories with the strength of her subjective desire. She sees beyond the category of Montague to the individual subjectivity that is Romeo. "'Tis but thy name that is my enemy. Thou art thyself, though not a Montague. What's a name? That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet." Romeo is more than the way that the culture of Verona wants to characterize him. He's more complicated than his label. He's not the bro that his bros want him to be, and he's not the joyful son that his parents want him to be. Juliet demands that he escape those expectations. She doesn't know Romeo is listening when she says this. He startles her by speaking, and after affirming her request that he give up his name, he tells her that he climbed the tall walls of the orchard with love's light wings, for stony libbets cannot hold love out. His love can simply fly over the walls that want to keep them apart. And of course, those walls are not just physical, they are the categories of Montague and Capulet that they both want to resist and overcome. Love itself is a form of resistance in a hateful Verona. Once the shock that Romeo is there fades, Juliet reflects on her embarrassment that she's been overheard. She's worried that she's played the role of a desired woman incorrectly. "If thou thinkest I am too quickly won, I'll frown and be perverse and say thee, nay, so thou wilt woo. I should have been more strange, I must confess, but that thou overheardest ere I was ware, my true love passion." She's supposed to be coy. She's supposed to make Romeo work for her love. That's what she's been told a woman does. Don't let boys know you like them. Be distant. Make them pursue you. She's unwittingly subverted the expectations of her position by saying that she likes him right away. Earlier in this act, Romeo left the world of men behind to pursue Juliet. With these words, Juliet acknowledges that she's left the world of feminine etiquette behind in order to pursue Romeo. These two are not just rebelling against the ancient grudge that their parents have for each other. They are rebelling against the norms that guide courtship, masculinity, femininity, and all of that. They're finding out who they are when the rest of the world isn't watching. When Romeo promises that he'll be faithful to her, he swears by the moon, and Juliet scolds him. That symbol won't work for her. The moon constantly changes and all of that. Instead, he should swear by thy gracious self, which is the god of my idolatry. The authority of the old symbolic order won't work. They need to build a new set of symbols to live by, and that process starts with each other. The first time that Juliet tries to say goodnight, Romeo says that he's left unsatisfied, and Juliet responds, "What satisfaction canst thou have tonight?" And the response, the satisfaction that Romeo is looking for, is the exchange of love's faithful vow. So that's an engagement, I guess? But it's more than that. They're looking for mutual self-recognition. They both want to be seen and chosen by each other. Not only do they want to become their true selves through this relationship, they're looking to be loved for that true self by somebody who chooses them freely, without the coercion of the outside world. And in doing so, they're looking to transform the world around them to better match that new self. They refuse to change or adapt to the world, so the world will need to adapt to them. This is revolutionary love from the start. It is love that wants to change the world. When Juliet hears a noise from within, it seems like the scene is going to end. Juliet exits. But if Shakespeare ended the scene here, it would mean that the outside world, with all its interruptions, demands, and opinions, has some influence on them. It doesn't. She returns to him. They say goodnight many times and on their own terms. Which brings us to scene 3. The friar enters the play, and in a little early morning monologue, he reminds us of the dualities always present in the world and this play. Within the infant rind of this weak flower, poison hath residence and medicine power. Just like the Queen Mab speech from Act 1, we have to remember that poison can be medicine and medicine can be poison. There is always going to be a shadow side to love. We know from the prologue how this story will end, and just in case we let Romeo and Juliet inspire us with their love poetry and their revolutionary love on that balcony, we get brought back to earth with the friar. He reminds us that there's always a tragedy on the way. Poison has residence in a flower. When Romeo enters, the friar realizes quickly that Romeo hasn't been to sleep and assumes that he's been with Rosaline, which also reminds the audience that Romeo has a habit of falling a little too fast and a little bit too hard. It reminds us perhaps that this inspiring, revolutionary, self-actualizing love we've just witnessed might simply be youthful foolishness. The friar calls out this foolishness, but he also sees potential for this union, for this alliance may so happy prove to turn your household's rancor to pure love. So it seems he also believes that their love might actually change the world. I mean, we know in the audience that it's their death that's going to transform the world, not their love, or maybe it's a fusion between their love and death, but that was the topic of the first video. Either way, we may think Romeo and Juliet foolish in their youth, but the presence of the friar and the nurse should also warn us that people don't necessarily get wisdom with age. Those two make plenty of mistakes on their own. It's not just the youth who act foolish, it's everybody. Which is a nice transition to the next scene, which features Mercutio, who, from where I'm sitting, has both youth and a little bit of wisdom. In the opening of Act 2, Scene 4, we find out that Tybalt has challenged Romeo. So once again, Romeo is being called back into the world of men, and this time it takes the form of Tybalt, who wants to fight Romeo. Romeo has tried to remove himself from the expectations of the world, and that world, of course, is going to try to pull him back. Tybalt is the embodiment of that social expectation. He takes the ancient grudge of Verona more seriously than anybody else. He takes the performance of masculinity, with all its bluster and violence, more seriously than everybody else. And he calls on Romeo to take it seriously as well. But Shakespeare is never simple. He's not just going to have Tybalt represent traditional masculinity, and then have Romeo represent a challenge to traditional masculinity, and then have them fight. Instead, he's going to give us Mercutio. And Mercutio launches into a critique of Tybalt's performance of masculinity. He begins this critique by first saying that Romeo won't be able to handle this fight, that he's already dead through love, once again fusing love and death. And after that quick detour, he properly launches his attack on Tybalt and how Tybalt has allowed his entire identity to be dictated by social expectation and the fashion of the day. According to Mercutio, Tybalt is obsessed with being a very good blade and a very tall man and so on. He takes the categories that constitute social status, good manners, the ability to fight, being tall, and then he makes those characteristics his entire identity. That's obviously in stark contrast to Romeo, who, as we saw on Juliet's balcony, attempts to forge a new identity independent from social expectation, tradition, symbols, or categories of status. Once again, Mercutio proves himself to be the liminal character that his name implies. He stands between Romeo the lover and Tybalt the fighter, and sees through both of them, makes fun of both of them. He's an iconoclast tearing down the socially imposed and artificial behaviors that the society of Verona values. And it's popular to talk about Mercutio's cynicism and bawdy rhetoric as a foil to Romeo's idealism and sentimental poetry, and there is plenty of insight to be gained by doing that. But, as different as they are both aligned against Tybalt's fashionable version of masculinity. Tybalt embodies the coercive pressure of masculinity. He cares about that symbolic order, and Tybalt wants to protect it. Romeo stands in opposition to him by being his opposite, a lover rather than a fighter. Mercutio stands in opposition to him by seeing through the performance of masculinity as a performance, as something fashionable. Both Romeo and Mercutio initiate a rebellion against the authority of Tybalt's gender essentialism. Romeo attacks the traditional elements, and Mercutio attacks the fashionable elements. Together, they are aligned because Tybalt's version of masculinity puts unnecessary restrictions on their behavior. It limits their subjectivity and their imagination. Romeo will eventually enter this scene, and the alignment between Mercutio and Romeo becomes even more clear. They have an insane dialogue together, filled with puns and extended metaphors. Mercutio is overjoyed to finally have a conversation partner who can match wits with him. He realizes that Romeo has found a way to be himself and exclaims, "Now art thou Romeo, now art thou what thou art, by art as well as by nature." Mercutio realizes that Romeo has become himself. We saw him forge that identity on the balcony at night, away from social expectation. And this self-actualization allows Romeo to see through the limitations of language and engage in Mercutio's wordplay. Their dialogue is obviously difficult for modern audiences and readers to understand since it depends on a bunch of early modern puns, but the important thing about this scene is that they are having fun together. These two characters who stand against social pressures of tradition and fashionable masculinity dance together on stage. Two individuals being exactly themselves, an authentic friendship, breaking through the limitations of language and playing with the fluid meanings of words and symbols, and in doing so, revealing a true self, a real Romeo and a real rebellion against the world through the playfulness of authentic friendship. If you can get that, then I think you understand the scene. Act 2 concludes with Romeo and Juliet meeting on stage in daylight for the one and only time that this happens in the play. Their love needs to be secret, and so they mostly meet at night. In Act 2, Scene 6, they secretly meet at the Friars in order to be married, and that's kind of a funny thing. I mean, the ceremony of marriage is a public acknowledgement of love. That's like the purpose of marriage. It's what the ceremony of marriage does. And yet their marriage happens in secret. It's one of the many paradoxes of this play, a public acknowledgement of love held privately. Romeo and Juliet love each other in a way that violates the norms of Verona, and yet they validate that love within a traditional constraint of marriage. Shakespeare is never going to be simple. This entire act has positioned the individuality of our protagonists in opposition to the expectations that the world has for them. Romeo and Juliet achieve their individuality through their encounter with each other, through their chemistry, through their mutual recognition of each other. They are a rebellion against the society that they live in. But it's even deeper and more abstract than that. Back in Scene 2 of this act, Juliet says that "'tis but thy name that is my enemy." The world that wants to keep them apart is constructed by language. It's the actual words and names themselves that create the hateful world of Verona. Romeo tells us that had he written, he would tear the word. Their rebellion is against the restrictive nature of language itself. They need to, like Mercutio, see through the limitations of language, break it apart, and rebuild it. And that's the topic of the next video, the tension between the language that we use and the meanings we intend. I'll focus on that idea as we go through Act 3 play-by-play in the next video. Please subscribe to be notified when that video comes out, and thank you for watching.